What if you blended Stalker and Escape from Tarkov, but with a low-poly facelift and also a furry theme? Well, you'd get a game called Project Silverfish, a new single-player survival game which caught my eye. And it turns out this game is way more interesting than, well, the visuals make it out to be. Let's talk about why this is such a cool project. So Project Silverfish is an early access survival title available on Steam, and while that's, essentially 10,000 other games these days, the fact that you play as animals and it also has a very positive review certainly got me to turn my head. And what I discovered was a shockingly deep game that you might not expect from something with, well, this poly count. You spawn into a massive web of interconnected maps spread out across rural and urban environments. You can pick a character or create your own at the start, which will give you access to either a central spawn hub area or your character's faction base. For most of my time with Silverfish, I stuck to spawning at the central hub, but once you learn the game's ins and outs, I could see being able to spawn in a specific faction's base is a great way to get a head start on certain quest loops. The game actually reminds me a lot of another survival game that I played recently called Surrounded. There are some key differences though, where Surrounded is being set in one massive continuous map, but a lot of what I liked in Surrounded is expanded on even further in Silverfish. Now in the starting hub area of this game, there are several vendors and other survivors that you can trade with and get missions from. The missions here aren't too crazy, they mostly seem like disabling jammers or other devices around the map. But they don't really need to be, because the missions are just an excuse to get out into the best part of the game, which is the general gameplay loop, which is built around exploration and combat. And even doing the missions kind of seem optional in this game, though they do seem like a decently optimized way of progressing your gear and getting money. It feels a little bit more like DayZ or Scum versus Tarkov or No Man's Sky. And what I mean is that the missions aren't like 100% required to progress forward with your character and capabilities. And to be honest, I think I'm really preferring that approach to survival games. It just feels more like a proper sandbox with optional objectives, so it makes it just feel more immersive. It fits the idea of actually surviving in a game a bit better rather than run these missions to survive. Okay, that's not exactly what I think of as a survival game. The missions here are used as tools instead of requirements, and it just feels like a more honest approach when creating this type of world. Now, this openness extends way beyond missions or progression though. When I first started playing Silverfish, I didn't realize how important the faction system actually is. I shot the first guys that I saw after leaving the safe zone, assuming that they were hostile. Turns out they were actually part of the same faction that runs the hub area I spawned in, and I had just made myself their mortal enemy, which means they would shoot me on sight if I ever tried to enter the hub again. In other words, I turned the one safe spot in the whole game into a hostile environment for me. And that's honestly a really cool level of freedom that most games wouldn't give their players. The obvious reason being that, well, I actually had to just restart the game because I lost all my gear and there's no way I could continue playing since I had to go through the hub to actually progress. But with that lesson learned, I started a new save and avoided shooting my own faction. From there, I started really exploring and checking out the surrounding areas. And while there's a lot of animal and zombie robot enemies in the nearby areas, the farther away from the hub you get, the more often you'll run into other hostile survivors. There's also stalker-style anomalies and artifacts that escalate in their weirdness the deeper that you get into the area. Again, I wasn't expecting this world to be as interesting or deep as it actually was when I first started playing, but I gotta say, I am pleasantly surprised. I also found it interesting how unafraid Silverfish is to be more of a game. Often survival games will try and get rid of all of their HUD elements or as many as possible to immerse you into the environment, but it can make understanding more complicated game mechanics, well, complicated. And Silverfish starts off that way with no on-screen HUD for your health or direction. But you can buy a headset that gives you an in-game HUD that shows those elements. Without the headset, you have to use a compass or constantly check your inventory to navigate and manage your stats. So if you want a more immersive experience, you can actually have it in Silverfish. But if you're okay with risking a $1,600 headset because you just want that compass on your heads-up display, the option is there. And I think just adding in those more gamey quality of life features by making them part of the world design and items is a really cool solution. It lets players just choose what type of game they want to play. Now, again, Silverfish is early access, but I gotta bring up the fact that many of the gameplay elements are not what I would consider polished or impressive. For example, the gunplay and the enemy AI. As you may have noticed, the guns in this game just kind of sort of float in front of you. There just isn't a ton of realism or nuance to the shooting mechanics. There is a ballistic model in Silverfish, so you have to lead your shots and account for drop, but at pretty much most of the engagement distances I was actually fighting at, these mechanics were barely a factor. Now, I understand that doing full weapon and character animations for first-person shooter games is actually super time-consuming and often very expensive, and maybe not even worth it for most indie dev teams, but it does kind of stick out as one of the main things where you go, oh, this game doesn't have proper weapon animations. Likewise, another very time-consuming and hard to do thing is enemy AI. They're pretty rudimentary. The animals and zombies just kind of walk straight towards you and harass you until you kill them. The other survivor characters are a little bit more complex. They'll hide and try and flank you, but fighting them kind of still mostly boils down to them trying to close the distance and just shooting them in the head. And the medical system is pretty darn simple. You take damage and use healing items like bandages to get back your lost HP. Keeping your hunger topped off regenerates your health faster, and well, that's about it. And I often find myself torn on survival games where I don't want them to be too complicated with the medical stuff, but also the lack of complication sometimes just makes the game feel a little more shallow. Where in Silverfish, I feel like I could even appreciate just a little bit more nuance in this area. Now, despite some of those nitpicking aspects of the game, I'm generally just blown away by how big and mature feeling Silverfish is, despite being an early access title. The overall map for the game is huge, with over a dozen areas to explore, and each one of them is the size of like a large Battlefield 3 or Battlefield 4 map with plenty of buildings to loot. And making it through just one of these areas unscathed is a daunting task, let alone trying to cross multiple areas to get to a new location. And they actually dropped a major update within minutes of me downloading the game for the first time, and it looks like they're updating the game on a pretty regular basis, with tons of new stuff, bug fixes, and balance changes. What you're getting for the money is a game with a massive world to explore and a ton of gear to play with, and it looks like the devs are primed to keep expanding on it. The craziest part is it's being made by just 2 developers. They say the game will be in early access for 2 years total, so it's got about another year to go, but at this point I wouldn't let the early access tag deter you from checking it out. There's already a ton of content to explore here, and despite not loving the visuals and the lack of certain animations, I totally understand the trade-off the devs made, and I think they made the right trade-off given their team size and the goals of the project. So while I can say sure, it would be great to have the game looking a little bit better, it's still an incredibly fun world to explore, and I'm still recommending the project. Considering just how raw many of the other survival games are that I've looked at recently, Project Silverfish is an easy recommendation among the growing list of indie survival games. Let me know if you've tried this game yet and what you think of it. And up next, you should check out this indie title where they put visuals and style at the absolute forefront. It's called Reloaded, and it is an incredibly impressive game. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.